Compassion is not a virtue, it is a commitment. So with that in mind, we're going to play a little hot potato with these messages. You'll just start passing on the messages, and then you'll end up with the message in your hand. At the end will be yours.
So let's give a warm Creative Mornings welcome to Heather Winkle. So this is me pulling my little brother's tooth. So compassion is a feeling of pity for the suffering of someone else, but it often includes the desire to help. So when I heard I was going to talk about compassion today, I thought, what does compassion even mean? I mean, what does the word really mean, and why will I enjoy talking about it? So let's go to the next slide, because we're going to break it down for just a minute. So it actually comes from the suffering with. And one of the definitions I found was actually really interesting. It was a fellow feeling. I loved that way of seeing this word, right? It has something to do with community, with connection with some other person, and really understanding and feeling what they feel. But it's not just that, it's actually doing something with that understanding. So we're in a room full of creative people, right? I think all of us tap into the deep feeling that gives us inspiration, that helps us to unleash some of our creativity. And it's not just understanding the feeling, it's how do you harness it? How do you tap into it? How do you take some understanding of it, some learning, and turn it into something different for the world, or different for the person who's feeling it? So today when we talk about compassion, if we could have the next slide, please. We're actually going to look at it from three perspectives. We're going to look at it from the user or the audience perspective. We'll look at it from a team perspective, and we're going to look at it from a self perspective. So before we go into that, I'm going to tell you a little about this fellow standing in front of you. So I'm a big sister. I'm the daughter of a teacher and an entrepreneur. They're here. Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad. I grew up being a musician, an artist, a dancer, trying different things, loving to experience new things and just see what I could do with it. When I graduated from high school, before I went to college, I traveled for a year in a program called Up With People. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a group of 140 students who spend a year traveling around the world. And in that year, I lived with 92 different families. And I lived with them in 25 different states and 8 different countries. And the group of people with me actually represented 15 different countries themselves. And so every couple of days, we would get on the bus and we'd go to a new city and we'd meet a new host family. And then we'd go out into the community and we'd do some sort of community service work. We'd learn something about that community and find a way that we could actually do something to make it better. And then we performed a show. And then we went home and we spent hours talking to our host families. And then we'd get on the bus and do it again. And the thing that I learned about that year was that I never knew what was coming. Like, I really never knew where I was going to be sleeping that night. I never knew who I was going to be encountering. I never knew what their ideas were going to be, what made them tick. And I had to partner with a whole bunch of people to get a lot of stuff done every day. And we're all coming from different perspectives. And so knowing that I was never going to know, that I was always going to be in a land of some sort of uncertainty, and that you could still find something to hang on to, and you would always find a way to connect, and you could always find a common ground, and you could always accomplish something, was one of the biggest takeaways I had that year. So after that year, I went to college, and I originally wanted to study architecture. But I quickly realized that it wasn't just about the problem solving and the complexity. It was actually wanting to solve on a very human level for people. So I switched into industrial design to bring that scale together. So the human factors, the psychology of how do people work, what are people trying to accomplish, and how do they do that with some sort of tool or some sort of process. And it was a fascinating study. But because I was at Carnegie Mellon and it was also the birth of the internet, I was surrounded by computers, and inevitably, they became part of my own practice. I worked for a little startup trying to write about this really, really bad software they were creating, just like doing some graphics and trying to help people use it. And finally, I was like, you know what? Hey, instead of me writing about this really bad software, could I actually help you make it better? And so that was my first step into interaction design. And it was a really interesting step because when I graduated from school, a little company called Netscape saw that I had some software experience and human factors experience and design experience, and so they said, hey, can we move you out to California and have you work at our company? And so I did. I moved across the country and worked at Netscape, got laid off 9 months later. So again, you never know what's going to happen, but you always know that there's going to be some sort of connection and something that you can do to keep moving forward. And I had made a lot of really great connections at Netscape, so it was actually pretty easy to find my next couple of jobs. And so I went to Intuit, where I was the first designer in-house working on Quicken for Windows, and helping people who had never done finances in any kind of digital way actually figure out how to manage their financial lives. Then I went to Yahoo, where I was actually the first mobile designer. This was back in 2000, so it wasn't like fancy iPhones. It was like T900 pagers. But it was a really interesting problem space. I designed every Yahoo property on all of the different devices in early Twitter 140 characters, right? But it was, how do you actually solve a problem with the tool somebody has? I then went to eBay, where I worked on the selling system, which was, people are trying to build businesses, and they're using eBay as a platform, and so how can we actually help democratize how people buy and sell? And what are people really trying to do as they're selling their Pez dispensers? I went over to after eBay went to Adobe, where you all probably know Adobe well as the Creative Suite, Photoshop, Illustrator. I actually led the team that worked on all the enterprise tools, so Acrobat, Reader, workflow processes, which was fascinating because it's, again, how do people get work done with their tools, and how do lawyers need to organize documents versus how do creative professionals need to work through documents? From there, I went to a couple of startups, and that was fascinating because I never knew what was happening, especially how I was going to pay my mortgage. And so I ended up finding my way to Apple, which is where I spent the next 6 years. And I actually worked on the database and small business apps team, where it was actually not, I was the lead designer on the product, but I was actually the developer educator on how to use a product to design a product for your customers. So it's really meta. But I also got to travel around and spend a lot of time visiting with customers and observing customers and learning a practice of seeing. And so that's my quick trip through my journey, and I'm going to save my final destination, which is Capital One, until my story at the end. So let's move on to the next slide. We're going to start with the user. So what do you see here? Is this your typical user? When I say user, I really mean audience. I mean the person whose problem you're trying to solve. And a lot of times when people approach problems, they're actually coming into it with a solution in mind. And the first thing you actually have to do is take a step back and realize you don't necessarily know the solution. And so you have to, next slide, observe. The first thing you have to do is get away from your computer and get out of your own head and actually go out into the world and understand, what are people trying to do? What is at the root of the problem they're trying to solve, the need they're going after? Are they feeling pain? They might be. Or maybe they're just trying to get something done. But by observing, you actually reframe the solution in your mind to the real problem and the real need. And because you're observing, you're not just listening, you're seeing things that the people might not even be able to articulate. Right? A lot of times you'll talk about going out and interviewing people, and that's great. That's better than just sitting inside in your own head. But by actually asking someone to go and do the thing they're trying to do in the real world with whatever tools they have, you'll start to discover some of the things they would never notice themselves. And you could start to ask about that. Why did you do that? I noticed you're doing this thing. What's that about? That's the aha that is actually going to get you anchored to the root of the need, and something you can use as a beacon. You can use it as a guide light through your problem solving. So let me tell you about a little aha at Adobe. We were actually working on the Acrobat and Reader product, and the problem, or the solution, the problem statement was like people need to find stuff in their documents, and the solution was we're going to create a better search tool. We're like, okay, you know, that's it's word-based a lot of times, but not always word-based. So we actually went out and we went to all sorts of different people's workplaces and homes, and just saw how they did their work. And one of the things we noticed was the stacks and stacks of papers that were all over the place. And so when we asked people like to find something in a document, the interesting part was they never went to the computer by default. They always went to some stack. And what we saw was they like would kind of thumb through it, right? And when we asked and we noticed, I mean, you can all feel the feeling of flipping through a book, right? But what are you seeing? You're seeing little glimpses of things as they go by. And you might remember it was something green on the right side of the page, right? And so we saw people do that over and over again. And we're like, there's obviously an unmet need here that a search box and search results aren't going to tap into. And so what that turned into was, I don't know if you've ever used Reader, but if you use a little scroll bar and scrub, you can see the little thumbnail preview of the page, so you can kind of like, oh, there it is, right? Now, that seems like a ubiquitous control. It's in most of the iPad apps, but that was actually the first time. That's my patent. But it came from a customer need. It came from an observation that we never would have seen, we never would have uncovered, and thought about what is a physically recognizable motion that you can use to actually get at that. One of my other examples is more recent from Capital One, which actually comes from some of the fraud work that we did, where the problem was there's been fraud on your card and you need to get a new one, right? But what was interesting was we could have just stopped at the problem of like press a button, tell them you need a new card, and the new card's going to get sent in the mail. But after going out and meeting with people, what we heard over and over again was, it's not about the new card. The new card has to work as well as the old one. So we were going to stop the problem. We were going to solve the problem too soon. We actually had to think through what is the problem that we're solving after they get the new card with all of the Netflix and Amazons, right? And so the problem statement changed because there was a need. And that's a need that we can use to guide the work. One of the things that's great about having one of those aha statements and being really crystal clear that that's what we're going after solving is as you work with teams, it's something that can keep you lined up. So let's go to the next slide, and we're going to talk about teams. So how many here work with teams? How many here works with a team where you're 100% aligned all the time? Because anyone who raises their hand right now is going to come give this part of the talk. Now, I mean, we're all human beings, and we all have creativity, we all have aspirations, we all have egos. And a lot of times when we work with teams, it's really hard to align. So alignment is something that you can't force because it's not authentic, right? You can't just say, let's get aligned, and believe that it's a true connection. So let's actually go to the next slide. So one of the things that tends to happen when we go about solving a problem is that people come with their assumptions, and they come with their expectations, and they come with mine. And everybody coming to the room is coming with mine. And so what ends up happening is it's mine and it's yours. And that puts a wall up. And so if you go to the next slide, when you actually take it out of mine and yours, and you start turning it into ours, that's when you can start to really line up. So you're not trying to align yourselves, you're trying to line yourself up to something that is shared. So if you've done the work of observing and you've crystallized around a real need or how to go after that need, that is something you can use to line up. So I'll never forget one of my first meetings back at Yahoo. It was very early on. It was probably in 2000, so I was pretty young, really young. And I was this really junior designer at the time, and I was going into a meeting that was going to be filled with about 30 different engineers, because the problem statement was all about, like, they were doing batches and they had to transform XSLT, blah, 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 into the front end, right? It was like really super techy, and I was the designer going in and being like, yay, guys, listen to me. I was terrified. And especially because what I needed to convince them of was how we were going to draw the interface in a way that customers could consume. And I knew from history that they were going to be against this idea. And so I was like, how am I going to go in and convince the room? But I didn't go in and convince them, and I didn't go in with my idea. I had heard from a couple of the people who were going to be in that meeting what the challenges might be. And I asked them why. I wanted to understand, where is this teammate coming from and what's important to them? And so instead of going into that meeting and saying, well, here's what we need to do, or going into that meeting and asking them, what do you need us to do? We went into the room and I put on the board, okay, so here's the problem I think we're trying to solve. Does everybody agree that that's the problem? And there was an agreement. And so, okay, but I didn't tell them, here's what I think it is. It was like, well, what do you think the problem is? And so in alignment, by having a beacon like this, I literally mean get up to the whiteboard with a marker or go up to a pad and write it up on the board so everyone can see it. Get everyone out of their own head and onto the whiteboard, right? Because then you're like, okay, well, I'm going to write the problem statement up there. And someone's like, oh, I don't agree with that. You're like, okay, so where is it wrong? You cross it out, add to it. All right, do we all agree to this? No, okay, I've got some considerations over here. Great, let's write them up, right? And so you start to build the problem statement together, and pretty soon, instead of having my ideas about the solution and their ideas about how they're going to build it, we actually have a board full of problems and ideas for how we're now going to go about it as a team to solve it. And so it's turning that observation and understanding and using that beacon to help actually connect and align teams so that you're not solving the problems for yourself anymore. You're actually solving the real human problem, and then each of you can bring your special skills to going after it. So let's go to the next slide, which is self. So this all takes a lot of energy, right? I mean, to be observant, to be open, to be in a land of gray, to have to harness something, to have to turn some sort of negativity or some sort of need into some sort of solution, it can take a lot of energy. It can tap you. I mean, a lot of us, I think, get fueled and inspired by that, but when you do it again and again, and especially when you do it as a profession and like you actually have to go in, it's like time to be creative, right? It takes energy. And so if you go to the next slide, this one's really about care. And so I spent about 15 years in Silicon Valley doing what I was doing, and it was exciting, and it was terrifying, and it was delightful, and it gradually wore me down a little bit. And I came to a point where I was getting divorced. Both my parents had health scares in 1 year, and I was like, wow, how did I end up in California, disconnected from my family, feeling like my creativity is starting to get tapped? What am I doing? What is important to me? And I went and got some therapy. But what was really interesting about it was the woman I worked with was actually, she was an energy worker. And what it felt like was we basically unzipped my skin and went and sorted through my soul and took it out and looked at little pieces of it to figure out, like, what makes me tick? and what is really important to me, and how am I using my energy every day to make sure that I am conscious and caring of that. Because if I can't do that for myself, I can't do that for my family, I can't do that for my customers and my audience, I can't do that for my teammates. And so I did that work with a very open mind, thinking maybe I'll leave the industry. I don't know where I'm going to live. What is next for me? And there was something I discovered along the way. If you go to the next slide, I read a book by Susie Welch, and it's called 10-10-10. And it's a way of going after problems from really different perspectives. And so you ask yourself a question. If I make this choice, how am I going to feel about it in 10 minutes? How am I going to feel about it in 10 months? How am I going to feel about it in 10 years? And so when I started asking myself the question, well, if I stay in California and I keep doing what I'm doing, what am I going to, let's go down the road 10 years. What might that be? I don't want to miss the next 10 years with my parents. I don't want to lose the opportunity to have a family, to start a family. So I put a lot of thought into what am I going to use as my beacon so that I can make choices that start to line up and solve the problem for that. And so I did a bunch of soul searching and decided I wanted to live in a place that was close enough that I could get to my parents in half a day, that had a friend who could help me build a new community, and had a really vibrant, artistic, creative spirit. And I looked at Boston, and I looked at New York, and I looked at DC, and I looked at Pittsburgh, and my friends in Richmond were like, pick Richmond, pick Richmond. And I was like, what's in Richmond? So I came and I lived with my friends in their basement over across the street from Visual Arts and prototyped a new life. Now, I was lucky, Apple had let me go remote. And so I knew I could pick a city, and I was going to be okay for a little while. And I fell in love with this city. I just fell in love with it. It had everything I wanted, all of the art, all of the food. But more than anything, as I walked down the street, people would talk to me. You could connect with people anywhere. I was amazed by how it felt. And so the time came, I moved my life across the country to Richmond. And it's amazing how when you find a beacon for what's important for you, and you start to make choices that line up to it, everything starts to fall into place. So I moved here, and a couple months later, I met my new husband. And a little while after that, my parents relocated and retired to Richmond, and now live a couple blocks from me. At my wedding, my brother met one of my best friends and fell in love and married her, and now he lives here too. And I got to know some amazing people and got connected into this creative community, and also realized that I was sitting in my own house working alone every day, and it was time for me to connect with other people again and actually have teams and work to solve really big problems with those people. And so I took a job at Capital One, which is where I've been for the last couple of years. And I love it. I love everything about my life. Oh, and the best part, which I just, like, this is so new to me. A couple of months ago, I finally adopted my daughter. So if we can go to the next slide. When we talk about these different perspectives of how you can start to observe and align and care about the needs of other people, and how you're going to work together to actually go after those, I want you to remember the next slide, which is that it really is about not just observing, but noticing and understanding. It's not just about aligning, but it's about connecting, and that you always have to do it from a place of authentic caring. And all of those things will start to line up, and hopefully you can harness your creative energy in a way that is sustainable and exciting, and use that to do a lot of great things. So thank you very much.